In Charlotte Perkins Gilman's 1915 unsung classic novel, Herland, 3 Western men arrive in a country ruled and populated by women. In this peaceful, thriving utopian society, the men must confront their own sexist ideals and mistaken notions about everything from education to relationships. Like the characters in the utopian society of the novel, Gilman lived a life dedicated to ideals such as feminism and social reform, including those outside societal norms. Herland is narrated by Vandyck Jennings, who embarks on an expedition with his friends Terry and Jaffe, the 3 central characters in the book. Van is not as sexist as Jaffe or Terry, but he struggles with the revelations he has while he learns about Herland and contrasts it with the world at home. As time passes, Van gains a new awareness of his false beliefs. Jeff struggles with the idea of women as equals, but he adapts more easily than Terry. Jeff's limitation is in seeing the women as being in need of protection. This southern gentleman attitude confuses Celis, who eventually becomes his wife. Terry's innate objection to women as independent is obvious from the first time he hears of a land populated solely by women. His first interaction with the women includes offering them baubles, trying to catch one and pursuing them, remarking that this is what women expect and like. Throughout the text, Terry continues to see women as lesser beings and objectifies them. In his mind, women are incapable of the very things he can see they've accomplished in their country. During the expedition, the 3 men hear stories of this peculiar land. They return home and make preparations to find it. The men land in Terry's biplane. They remain convinced that there are men in this country too. They meet 3 young women, Ellador, Alima, and Celis, who outsmart them and flee. The 3 men continue to explore the forest and are taken captive by women they privately call the Colonels. Notable is the novel's symbol of the forest, a symbol of order. Like everything in Herland, the forest is orderly to the point of seeming clean, even though it's outdoors. At one point, the women are even replanting trees in a precise, ordered way. When the men first see Herland, Van notes that it is a land in a state of perfect cultivation, where even the forests looked as if they were cared for. Here, as they enter the forest on foot, Jeff adds, "Talk of civilization. I never saw a forest so petted." This overwhelming sense, in the various references to the forest, is that the land is orderly and rational, traits not ascribed to women at the time historically. Van continues to circle back to the women's impression of order upon the landscape so that every tree bore fruit, edible fruit. Readers will soon see how the Herlanders have taken the chaos of nature and shaped it into a useful forest that provides for their needs. The choice to do so spanned generations, and it continues in the current members of the community. They do, as with all aspects of their country, what is logical, taking on arduous tasks to achieve a logical answer to their needs. Despite no evidence pointing to the presence of men, Van, Terry, and Jeff continue to believe there are men somewhere in the country. The men's captivity is not difficult. They're provided every comfort while they're educated in the language and the women's world. First of all, the men's quarters is one of the central symbols in the novel. Their rooms are symbolic of the need for freedom. No matter how lovely a prison it is, it's still a prison. This is manifest in numerous literary texts where the women are kept imprisoned. Beautiful homes, lovely dresses, and doting husbands are still limiting if there's no choice but to accept restrictions. The men's experience is this in Herland. The men are given a set of comfortable rooms. They're not imprisoned anywhere unpleasant or remotely uncomfortable. Their every need is met, except freedom. Jeff points out they've given us a room with no great possibility of escape, and personal liberty heavily chaperoned. The lack of freedom is highlighted by the fact that their quarters are in a fortress at the top of a cliff. With no freedom, their rooms, no matter how lovely, become a prison. Many women of Charlotte Gilman's time experienced this situation in the domestic sphere, a beautiful, comfortable prison where their basic needs were met. This theme occurs in other literature of the time, including a slightly earlier text, Henrik Ibsen's 1879 play that was critical of a traditional marriage, A Doll's House, which would have likely been familiar to the readers of Herland. They're also given clothing, another of the main symbols of Herland. The Herlanders focus on logic and practicality. It may also be considered a symbol of the lack of competitiveness that the women of this country embody. Much is made of how practical and comfortable Herland clothes are, noting the plentiful pockets. When the men visit the Herland gymnasium, Van realizes the clothing is not only comfortable, but as perfect a garment for exercise as need be devised, absolutely free to move in, and much better looking than our usual one. Clothing is the clearest symbol of the distinction between the two worlds. Further, clothing highlights the characteristics of the Herlanders: practical, humble, and without artifice. This is a direct contrast to how the three men expect women to dress in a society of all women, with frills and furbelows, the trappings of femininity that would have been current in the contemporary world. Notably, Terry, the most sexist of the three, had complained about the women's dress initially. They weren't feminine, they lacked charm. To this, Van adds that their dress and ornaments had not a touch of the come and find me element. Instead of impractical dresses and undergarments that restrict athleticism and freedom, the clothing of Herland is designed for utility. As with the politics and landscape, the choices made here are logic-based. The men have 3 tutors. After several months, however, Terry's frustration with the lack of freedom and feeling of powerlessness leads him to convince the other men to attempt an escape. The 3 men do escape, traveling by night and living off the land. They reach the biplane, where they again meet Ellador, Alima, and Celis. Once again, the men are taken captive. Returning to their comfortable prison, the men continue to learn, and eventually, after about 6 months, they're given leave to speak to more of the citizens of the country in lectures. They are also allowed to roam freely. At this time, the men begin to court Ellador, Alima, and Celis. Terry and Alima have a confrontational relationship. Van and Ellador become friends. Van tells little of Celis and Jaffe's relationship. In short order, all 3 men marry. Van marries Ellador. Terry marries Alima, and Jaffe marries Celis. The reader learns that both Van and Terry are having difficulties, especially in the area of sexual relations. Ultimately, Van reaches a point where he notes he'd rather have Ellador's companionship than sexual relations. Celis is pregnant, so the implication is that Jaffe and Celis are working on the issue between them. Terry and Alima continue to struggle, to the point that she refuses to be alone with him. Terry, rather than trying to understand Alima's perspective, hides in a room and attempts to rape her. He is stopped and thrown in prison. The sentence for his horrific act is expulsion. Jaffe opts to stay in Herland. Van and Ellador choose to return to America with Terry, and the novel ends with both Terry and Van being asked to promise they will not reveal the location of Herland. Herland is a novel that, if the long sections on philosophy and social psychology were removed, would be left with a very simple, possibly somewhat thin plot. And yet the novel is dense with powerful themes. The adherence to the theme of natural order is part of every aspect of the country in Herland. In the physical space, gardens and forest, this is a focus. It's also the basis of parenting, education, and community. Everything flows from the natural order of motherhood. Van explains, here was Mother Earth bearing fruit. All that they ate was fruit of motherhood, from seed or egg or their product. By motherhood, they were born, and by motherhood, they lived. Life was, to them, just the long cycle of motherhood. The result of this community-based attitude was a utopia, a perfect society. Van says the untroubled peace, the unmeasured plenty, the steady health, the large goodwill and smooth management which ordered everything left nothing to overcome, and compares the society to a pleasant family in an old, established, perfectly run country place. By structuring their society around a common goal, they were able to create a society that was without conflict or difficulty. Women's restrictions is another impactful theme. The comparison between the two worlds highlights how illogical restrictions on women's education, dress, and activities are. Throughout the entire text of Herland, the comparison between the two worlds emphasizes the ways in which a community thrives without gender-based restrictions. The most obvious example of this is the case of attire. Van explains, this led me very promptly to the conviction that those feminine charms we are so fond of are not feminine at all, but mere reflected masculinity, developed to please us because they had to please us, and in no way essential to the real fulfillment of their great process. In Herland, in a country where women do not have the burden of men's opinions, citizens have evolved into something remarkably different. They have order, education, practical clothes, and shared community. They also have fitness, ample food, sufficient space, and no conflict. Van cannot help but compare this to the world the men knew. Physical and mental agility is another major theme in Herland, where physical fitness is as important as mental fitness. Women's physical fitness is illustrated in the gymnasium, in their agility among the trees, in the women's physical labor. This is balanced by an interest in learning, which the reader sees in the women's interest in the comparisons to the men's world. The women are consistently described as being fit and strong. In the initial encounter, Van notes, "Never, anywhere before, had I seen women of precisely this quality. Fishwives and market women might show similar strength, but it was coarse and heavy. These were merely athletic, light, and powerful." This is in keeping with Charlotte Gilman's own theory that fitness was essential, and it is in direct contrast to the then popular ideas that led to the medical treatment for women known as a rest cure. The women of Herland are strong without being unattractive. The still common term for women as the weaker sex is countered repeatedly by the examples of the novel. These women are skilled in both the mental and physical tasks of a job, but the men are lacking in this new country. Even at the point of the attempted rape, Van points out how strong the women are. The women not only stop Terry's horrible act, but handle his imprisonment and punishment with ease. They show both physical and mental prowess all throughout the novel. Herland was first published in 1915 in the magazine Forerunner, but Charlotte Perkins Gilman may be most well known for her 1892 short story, The Yellow Wallpaper, a story with many themes reflected in Herland. Gilman passed away in 1935, but her prolific writing, lecturing, and activism continued unimpeded until her death, and Herland's indelible mark on ideals pertaining to feminism and social reform can be felt to this day.